If you had something to celebrate today or in the coming weeks, please put that in the chat. Let's just start off on a positive tone, something to think about, get our mindset in the right place, and hoping that we all have celebrations come in all different sizes. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to share something, and also where you are coming from. Where are you? We have about 18 already in the room and some more coming in. So thank you for being here. First of all, welcome. This is a real celebration. My name is Nancy Squicciarini, and I'm the lead facilitator for ECIS, and it's a pleasure. Joining me from ECIS today as well is Sarah Kupkel, who is head of professional learning and just an amazing overall person who's always quite supportive. So shout out for Sarah. We just love you, love you, love you. So as I mentioned, this is the launch of the ISL ECIS Loft, and what I am so proud about is this is a joint venture with the International School of Luxembourg. Those of you who, before coming to ECIS, I worked at the school for 31 years. Yes, 31 years, and I loved every second I had with it. Became a family. So to do this joint venture, and I would like to have a very dear man speak and just also say hello. He is the director at ISL, Dr. DJ Condon. So DJ, please unmute, say hello, and thank you for this initiative that we're going to be going on this journey together on.
Yeah, okay. Well, welcome everybody. That we're resuming the lofts. As Nancy mentioned, I just hearing the celebration song again, and just how much I miss working with you, Nancy. And just wow, it's so great to be doing this again, with working with you again. And you're very much missed around here, and now we get to continue on, and that's really great news. So we're looking forward to continuing these lofts. These are really important professional conversations. And I want to just say a little bit about Helen Kelly, that we've never met in person before, but yeah. A while back I was listening to a podcast from another beloved former colleague, John Nickton's got his International Schools podcast that I listened to religiously, and heard John's interview with Helen. And I had already been really concerned in this pseudo post-COVID era about educator burnout and about colleague resiliency and emotional well-being. Helen's interview with John just struck every chord. I immediately went and bought her book and read her book and started doing all this other research. And I just think this is such an important topic for all of us in schools. So to me, we got a great convergence here. We get Nancy's positive energy, and we get Helen Kelly and talking on something that's really important to all of us right now. So thrilled to be here, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, DJ. We're so thrilled. Really, this is going to be so exciting, and this will be going on for the whole year. So this is our first launch event. And with the Loft, we actually have, what do we strive to do with the Loft? Well, when we think about the Loft, the first thing we want to do is promote these unique these insights. And that's why we're thrilled that
around the roundabout.
Oh, we have somebody who needs to mute. My goodness, don't you love hearing a child's voice at the end of the day? We want to give these insights, and that's why it was great to have Helen join us. The Loft also wants to elevate all the voices we have in this room, and also the voices that we have in the international school community. So we're hoping we get more and more guests to share their insights and their perspectives. We also want you to meet each other. So there will be an opportunity for a breakout session to talk to one another and get your ideas about some of the provocations you heard. And the last is, we hope that with Helen here, we're going to be providing a major resource looking for sustainable practices. So that's what we strive to. Our approach is I always start with the idea of starting with the heart. So the Loft is about building a community, all of us joining together, learning to just collaborate with one another. The head is going to be everything that Helen is talking about, those provocations, those concepts, those ideas. And the hands refers to when you leave this hour session, we are really honored that you are spending an hour with us. For many of us, it's the end of the day, and you decided to be online again. So our objective is, once you leave, you have a takeaway, an application that can you can do tomorrow. And that is something we do it's intentional. So how are we going to collaborate before we start? I introduce Helen. Well, the first is put your email addresses or your Twitter handle in the chat. We will follow you. Just get it in there so we start building that community. There's ECI Schools. I'm Nancy and Luxton Twitter. The next idea is how we're going to engage. When we're in the large group, video can be on and off, whatever you feel most comfortable. I love seeing some friends right now when their video's on, because I see some friends like Monica and Henrietta, and I just love them so much. So with the cameras on, you get to see the faces, but when you are in the small group, please be sure that you have your video on, and when you're in the groups. And the most important thing about this hour is to smile and to enjoy. It's the end of the day, everybody. So we need to really embrace this moment that we here are together. So this is what we're striving to do. Anybody who's on Twitter, start tweeting. You can take pictures. I have my camera already. That's our hashtag. And now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Helen Kelly. Now, I have to admit, I have the same introduction as DJ because I first got introduced to Helen through John Micton through his podcast. And she is one from reading her book and then listening to her podcast. And I went to her website that I know Abby's been putting her link in the chat. She's committed to helping schools. And it's really to maximize the well-being. And that also makes an impact on school culture. If you look at what her experiences, she has been a leader in Asia, she's been a leader in Europe, and then, you know, she's done the same thing I think I have. She said she's retired, but I don't think she's really retired. Prior to that, she was a lawyer for 10 years, but now she is really working with schools to bring a very valuable and she brings a perspective to her work. And what I love what she's talking about with well-being, it's a strategic approach. It's not just having cupcakes in the staff room or all of a sudden having, you know, a half a day for well-being hour. It's a strategic initiative that you're looking at to prevent burnout and have a positive work culture. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Helen Kelly. So everyone, let's give like a virtual round of applause for Helen. Woohoo! We love this. So Helen, thank you so much for being the launch. You are the first person ever on the ISL ECIS Loft. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Nancy, and thank you to everyone who's been involved in bringing this together. It's really exciting, and I feel really privileged and honoured to be the first guest for the launch.
So I have to tell you, your book is what inspired me when after I heard the podcast with John Micton. And I guess my first question is a kind of a basic one, but many people just want to know, what inspired you to write School Leaders Matter?
Well, I think it's been 4 decades in the making, to be honest. I mean, you mentioned briefly that I was a lawyer for 10 years before I went into education, and I worked in the field of health and safety at work. So I acted for trade union members who'd suffered from industrial diseases and had industrial accidents. And so my interest in workplace wellbeing goes well back, you know, to, I'm showing my age now, but well back to the late 1980s. You know, and then I requalified to become a teacher. And I was a principal in international schools for 15 years, as you've said, in Asia and in Europe. And I studied for my EdD, which started in 2013. So that was 10 years ago. And I decided at the time I was experiencing issues with my own well-being, having transitioned from Asia to Europe and the demands being quite different. And so I decided to focus my EdD research on international school leader well-being. And, you know, that's 10 years ago. And then in the way that they say doctors make the worst patients, unfortunately, in 2019, I experienced an occupational burnout myself. And I had to leave my career in schools behind and took the decision to move away from that. So I think that, you know, this was all building up to the book. I'm really lucky that my first passion really is writing. I love writing. And I'm also, if I had to use one word to describe myself, I would say curious, So I wanted to find out more about why is it that the school leader's role has become more demanding and what can we do about it? And then really I've been on a mission for about the last 5 years to raise awareness about this and to make school leaders care about their own well-being, because they don't care about their own well-being enough, but also to make school communities and everyone else responsible in the education sector to understand why school leader well-being is important. And so those are the things that drove me to write the book.
And your book, I think, came at such perfect timing, knowing that we just went through COVID and looking at well-being was elevated, but now it's that intentionality. I mean, from your experiences and from your research, because you've worked in Asia, you worked in Europe, you've been a lawyer, what has caused schools in terms of why is it becoming so emotionally draining? What has caused leadership and teachers' roles to become more emotional? We could say it's COVID, but more than that, why has it evolved so much in terms of the past decade or 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole chapter in my book about this, and it goes back more than 15 years. It goes back about 50 years when the role of schools began to change. And I won't go into all the details about that, but people can read that in my book. And the role of the school leader and the role of teachers and other staff that work in school began to change as more and more is expected of schools, and the roles that schools play in society has, you know, moved on and expanded massively. But if we think about international schools, Nancy, the truth is that leading international schools has always been emotionally demanding. You know, we just haven't really spoken about it much. You know, the truth is that we are responsible as leaders for a community that is often very transient. And everyone is impacted by that, not just the people who are moving, but the people who are left behind when others move on. We're also responsible for a community that is very diverse culturally, and they have a lot of very different expectations about what school is for, the role of the school, the way things should be done in school, you know. And, you know, whilst school leaders experience these kind of emotional demands because of their relationships with all stakeholder groups, other people that work in schools, not just educators, but all staff, are also experiencing these same issues. You know, my EdD thesis was actually called International Schools as Emotional Arenas, with the leadership challenges. And I think that we have to acknowledge that that international schools are emotional arenas. And all this has been happening. My first research goes back 10 years. So it was happening a long time before COVID. But what we do know is that the pandemic has really not just raised the profile of the importance of well-being, but has actually impacted well-being negatively, quite significantly. And it's actually very interesting that literally just this week, 2 days ago, a report was published in the UK, which has been put out by researchers that have come from 3 different countries, Australia, I think Sweden and the UK, looking at data mostly from the UK, that shows that 2/3 of educators feel that they are supporting the emotional needs of students more than they were before the pandemic, and they are supporting the emotional needs of colleagues more than they were before the pandemic. And 1/3 of those individuals say that they do not feel prepared for this. And 80% of leaders and 70% of other educators say that this is impacting negatively on their own well-being. So that's hot off the presses just this week. So, you know, it has got worse.
You had a section in your book of how, you know, you become a leader does not necessarily mean you have that skill set to deal with the emotional challenges. And you talked about the idea of even, it's almost, if this is the right word, but you don't say you're burned out as a leader because it's seen as a weakness. You can't tell your colleagues. If you tell your colleagues, then they're going to think, well, what's wrong with you? We should just be able to, you know, stand up and keep on doing and putting in 12, 15 hours. But eventually you have to articulate. And why is it that some schools leaders aren't able to articulate, I have burnout? without feeling there's repercussion from it.
Well, there is a stigma, isn't there? And we have to think about the way that leadership has been thought of in the past. And we've had this model of the hero leader, haven't we? And now we've moved on to the servant leader, which is another model of leadership. And both of those models are really encouraging us to abnegate our own needs for the needs of our community. And so it's become normal and accepted that this is something that we do. But what we're starting to understand now from the research is that actually looking after the well-being of leaders actually has a massive knock-on impact to the rest of the staff and then to students. And therefore, there are strategic reasons why we should look after the well-being of people that work in schools, because ultimately it impacts the bottom line of what we do, which is student outcomes.
Absolutely. And the students know when they can feel when teachers aren't well. They might not say anything, they can sense it. Both my boys went to the international school. They would know when a teacher was not feeling well. I'm like, oh, did they say something? They said, Mama, we can just feel it. You know, when walking around the building, in French we say there's an ambiance in the building, that people are just exhausted. And now it's May 17th, and we're coming to the end of the school year for many people. That's why I'm thanking you again for everybody who's here, because it's May and we have almost 30 people here and they're doing a virtual session. But I also think because this topic resonates with so many people, acknowledging burnout and just having a culture in your school to allow to articulate it, because the team. So I'll give you a question then. Looking at the teams that we have within schools, how should leaders evaluate their current teams to determine its effectiveness to elevate the well-being of staff? How should they look at their teams? Because it's the leadership, like you said, that really models the behavior for the staff, which eventually impacts the student learning.
Yeah, well, I think that all well-being in schools should start with the leadership team. It then cascades down. And I am working with a small number of innovative and bold schools at the moment that get this, and they know it needs to start at the top and it will cascade down. Thriving leaders, thriving staff, thriving students, you know.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the first thing to emphasize. But I think it's also important for us to understand that when we talk about well-being, there is never one size fits all. So what we have to do is find out about what's happening in our school and what do we need and what do we need to do in order to put the right tools in the hands of the right people in order to make a difference. And in my book, as you've already referred to, there is a strategic framework for this, which can be applied equally to leader well-being as to the well-being of the rest of the staff or to the well-being of students. You know, my book is about leaders, but this applies and I use it in schools for the whole community. So what schools should be doing is starting really with laying the foundations, which is by having a team in place whose responsibility it is to look at these things. And then what we need to do is educate stakeholders. So we need to educate all of the stakeholders in all of the stakeholder groups to understand why well-being is important. And we've got a foundation that we can move on from. And then we need to gain insights by either collecting data or actually using the data we already have, Nancy, because most schools have data now, but they don't really do much with it. And many schools come to me with these wonderful platforms that they've bought into with so much data and they have no idea where to start, you know. But that data could be surveys, it could be well-being, workplace culture surveys, workload surveys. It could be HR data. So, for example, absenteeism rates, the amount of healthcare that staff are using, obviously all anonymized, or exit data interview, you know, from staff exit interviews. And so we then start figuring out what our priorities should be, because we're starting to understand what the needs are. You know, once we've done that, we can then start setting goals and priorities and putting interventions and initiatives in place to make change. But we can't do that effectively unless we know what's happening in our school and what we need. And so I think that it's all well and good to offer all kinds of well-being initiatives to show people that you care about them, but really we're only going to make a big difference if we're strategic about it.
I think the idea of strategic and using that data, because so many times schools do have these surveys, they get these enormous amount of tables or Excel sheets, but at times I think that data gets overwhelming. They don't know where to start.
Yes.
Where do I first, and what would you recommend? Where do you start when you have all this data and saying, I need to make an impact on my staff. I have this, I'm asking staff for this feedback. Where should I start? Where would be your recommendation?
I think there are 3 areas, Nancy, that the research shows that in educators, whether they be leaders or teachers, there are 3 areas that are most likely to contribute to burnout. The first one is workload, and no one wants to talk about this, do they? It's awkward, you know. When I worked in my school in Berlin as a principal, I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say that when the staff wanted to do a workload survey, I felt threatened and I didn't want it to happen. And it created a lot of issues between myself and the Betriebsrat, you know, and I'm more enlightened now. But workload is the place to start, and it needs to be done collaboratively. You know, it's not that the school's got so many resources that they can buy in extra staff. It's us all figuring out together, what is it about the workload, which areas of workload are impacting us negatively, and what can we actually realistically do about it, and to collaborate around that. So that's the first thing. The second area is community. So this really is about the amount of support we're receiving, but it's really about the positive workplace culture. And lots of the work that I'm doing with schools at the moment is around that. How do we create that sense of belonging? It's so much more important in international schools than it is in other schools, you know? How do we make people feel that they belong here, that they're recognised and valued, respected and appreciated? How do we make sure that the quality of interactions between individuals is of the highest quality? So I think those are the 2 most important. And then the third one is about control. So individuals need to have autonomy over their work, regardless of what level they work at. And so that's the third thing to look at. And, you know, if I'm honest, I think IB schools are so much better at this because we have a collaborative environment. Collaboration is part of the DNA of IB schools, whereas there are so many other schools I work with around the world that don't have that. And there's no staff voice, there's no collaboration, there's not even that much consultation. It's a very top down. And where things are top down, you're likely to have a much more negative workplace culture, and that's going to impact on everyone's well-being.
I'm going to summarize that for everyone. So the first is looking at workload, because, and again, I agree. I think some leaders might feel challenged or feel like they're being defensive, knowing workload is very difficult because it does affect the budget. It does affect in terms of staffing, and how do you navigate that? Number 2, sense of belonging. When I think of sense of belonging, that's such intentionality, you know, looking at how you organize your meetings. Are you prepared for a meeting? Are you looking at, you know, I love the work of Bob Gomstrom, where he talks about every meeting starts with an inclusion activity. Kieran Dowling, who's out there, adaptive schools, the idea of just elevating everyone who's in that room. And the third is control, having that flexibility to allow, respecting who they are as professionals.
Absolutely. It's feeling accepted and valued, but it's also about having a say. It's also about having a role in the decision-making process. And, you know, I can't think of the data off the top of my head, but I think it's somewhere in the region of 60 or 70% of teaching assistants, for example, say they have no say in their day-to-day work. And about a similar number of teachers say they have no say in the decision-making process in the running of the school. So it's having a say over what we do on a daily basis. But if we're going to have a sense of belonging, Nancy, we need to feel that we've got, you know, a stake in the bigger picture.
Yeah, and it has to be all school. You can't have one section of the school trying to create this culture of belonging, then another section. It really has to be, as you said, the entire school leadership having those efforts that are directed where, regardless of where you are in the school, you still have that sense of belonging and feeling like you're validated as a member of staff.
Absolutely. So what we see in schools, what I see very typically, is that people feel much more of a sense of belonging to their team than they do to the school as a whole. But also the sense of belonging varies from team to team, depending on the skillful nature of the leaders of that team and the individuals in that team. But what we are trying to aim for is a sense of belonging to the whole school, not just a sense of belonging to one team, you know?
No, exactly. Because I know when I was a leader, head of community relations, I have to say that was my number one team. Their well-being, everything about them, they were my family. Like I know we can't say their family, their colleagues, but and then you have to start thinking, well, I was part of this leadership team. They should be my number one team.
Yeah.
But then it's trying to navigate, where do you feel your most sense of belonging between those various teams?
We have to remember, Nancy, that in international schools, the sense of belonging is so much more important. And this is one of the reasons why it's so demanding, you know, for leaders, is because we are everything for some people. We are not just their professional life, but we are their personal lives. And I'm not just talking about staff and students, I'm talking about parents as well. And so the responsibility on us to create a sense of belonging for those people who are living away from their normal support structures is really key.
Everything you're saying, I think, resonates. And I from watching everyone in this session, I see a lot of nodding. So I think right now we're going to stop for a minute, because as we said, we want you to meet one another. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use a protocol that is called the 4 L's. And you're going to go in for about 15 minutes. And we want you to first introduce yourselves. Please set somebody as a timer so they have an idea to provide equal voice. And you're going to pick 1 L to speak about in terms of what you heard from Helen today. What is it, something that you've learned? What is something that you would want to leverage in terms of your own role in your own capacity? What did you like? And what link to you did you have, or what link did you have? So you can have it as a noun, the link, or a verb, to link, in terms of your role that you presently have. So you have either learn, leverage, like, or link within your rooms. Pick one. Be sure to introduce yourself, because that's part of us building a community as part of the loft. Did everyone get one of the L's? Are you thinking of one of the L's? Give a thumbs up. You have an L? And I know Abby's going to put that in the chat, the 4 L's for you. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about what L you're going to be sharing. And I'm going to be making the breakout rooms. And they're going to be quite small, because we really want you to be able to connect with one another. And while you are thinking about what you're going to say, I'm going to be making the rooms. Okay, we have 3 to 4 in a room, and you have 13 minutes, I lied, and 1 minute for a countdown. We'll see you back about 1:45, and when we get back, we're going to be talking about what strategies should be in place at your school when thinking about the start of the school year to avoid the burnout. So welcome, making sure we have people not in the same school. For example, I have Monica and John in the same room, and that would be I'm just going to move Monica. Okay, everybody. Enjoy, and we'll see you in about 13 minutes. Hopefully you enjoyed that. It was a long session, but I know that was a great discussion. James, thank you for saying that. And I love that people are giving thanks. Right now, if you had to create a 6-word summary of your conversation, what would those 6 words be? Everyone type it in the chat, but don't press return yet. A 6-word summary about your conversation. I hope you exchange email addresses as well. A 6-word summary of that conversation. Are you ready? Thumbs up if you're ready. Ian's like, no, I'm not ready, Nancy. You're going too quick.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think that might be 7.
Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Everyone press return. Let's see your 6-word summaries. I love the thank yous. Technology is not to blame. Absolutely. Remember what John Michton says. It's not the technology, it's the user. Oh, you're saying it is to blame. I'm saying the opposite. Oh, don't worry about me. It seems like your conversations were very worthwhile. Helen, we have the last 15 minutes, and I thought we would start turning it, thinking about the next school year and what strategies that could be in place for schools to support leaders in terms of their well-being. And one area of the book really caught my eye because I do a lot of training with middle leaders. And you mentioned, and I'll say how leadership should be embracing their middle leaders and how that would actually support them with their well-being. Can you share some more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, my experience in schools, Nancy, and we talked a bit about this yesterday, is that, well, first of all, leaders are carriers of the culture. And the culture of the school has a massive impact on well-being. So I think in some data that came out from last year said that 30% of teachers in international schools think that the culture of their school has a positive impact on their well-being. 30% thinks it has a negative impact, and 30% are not sure. So first of all, leaders are carriers of the culture, but middle leaders in particular, I think, play a key role in developing and supporting a positive workplace culture. But unfortunately, we really don't understand in most schools just how important and precious a resource our middle leaders are. And they are massively undertrained and under-resourced, creating that sense of belonging. You know, the middle leaders play a huge role in that, showing appreciation and recognition, allowing others to feel valued, creating an environment within their teams where interactions are civil and respectful. That people work, we used to have a phrase when I worked at my school in Hong Kong, people work is the work. This isn't the work, you know, this isn't the stuff that stops us, that takes us away from doing the work. People work is the work. And unfortunately, I mean, the same with senior leaders, but certainly at the middle leader level, we're not trained enough in how to do the people work. We're not made sufficiently aware of how important the people work is. And that training is not in place. And so what's often happening with middle leaders is that they are transactional. They're not transformational. They're managing things. They're not leading. And what we need to do, and the most successes I've ever had in schools have been where I've been able to take the middle leadership team to that next level. And of course, when you do that as well, it has the also has an impact on supporting a senior leader well-being. And I'm not talking about just farming out loads of the work to middle leaders. I'm talking about empowering middle leaders, you know, to be able to do that people work successfully. And then the whole culture of the school, of the workplace changes. Does that make sense?
What you're saying aligns directly with middle leaders that I work with. Sarah would know this. I was working with a cohort of almost 36 middle leaders, and I did a survey. How much training did you receive before going into the role? So it was, I was doing a course, and there were 36 on it was last year. And out of 36, it was either sporadic, none, or intentional.
Yeah.
Out of 36 middle leaders, 21 said no training in this course before. So they got their job like in April or March. And then when they started their position in August, they had no training. And this was a course that I was doing with Sarah was there with me. And we were just, they were urging what you were saying. They wanted that skill set to know how do they navigate their teams? How do they create this culture? And they just were overwhelmed. They did not know this, working with their peers now in a leadership position. So it really resonates and aligns with what Sarah and I are finding working with the middle leaders that we do work with.
Yeah, I think what's also important, Nancy, and we don't do this enough, is that we create that team identity for middle leaders so they have each other and there is a culture within that team, and that team is a support. And often what happens, especially in secondary schools where examination results are so important, is that we have competition between departments and we don't have a supportive middle leadership team. They don't think of themselves really as a team. And so training them together as a team, I think, is important. Those kind of team building activities, you know, that go beyond your kind of, you know, typical
Or something, yeah.
There's some things that you build up over a period of years, and keeping middle leaders in their roles for at least 3 years, I think is really important, because then you can create that team identity, and you can provide them with the skill set that you just talked about.
Well, that's one strategy that the leaders and the individual on this session could think about for next school year. Regarding well-being, regarding burnout, what other tools and strategies would you suggest for teachers and for leaders to consider for the start of the next school year?
Well, I think when you've got new teachers coming into the school, Nancy, first of all, they want to know that you're serious and intentional about their well-being, that you care about them. So if you are already doing things, if you have a whole range of things in place and you have a strategy and you have ambassadors and a team and a policy and initiatives, you need to make everyone aware of that. You need to make them aware of the journey of where you've come from and where you're going to. And you need to remind returning staff as well of this journey, so that this is always on the agenda and everyone can see the timeline and understand what the goal is, you know. But I think it's also about providing staff with information about how to manage their own well-being. And I absolutely do not suggest for 1 minute that should be instead of strategic approaches. All the research shows strategic approaches at an organizational level are the single most important, you know, way to address this. But providing them with resources to help them to understand their own well-being and how they manage their own stress, I think, is also key. If you do not already have a strategic approach in place, then obviously you need to start doing that. So starting off with forming a wellbeing team, thinking about who's going to be in that team. There's lots of stuff in my book about how you should go about forming a team, who should be in it, how people should be informed of what the role of the team is, roles within the team. And then you can move on to starting to look at what data you've got and where the gaps might be and what data you want to you need to gather because you've got gaps. But then all of that stuff, most of that stuff addresses work demands. But there's also another side of the equation that I call work recovery. And I talk about this in my book too. And work recovery is much more under the control of the individual teacher, leader, member of staff. And the research shows that in order to be experiencing effective work recovery in our non-work time, we need to be engaging in 4 work recovery experiences regularly and frequently. And they are psychological detachment. So we need to be switching off, not just from doing work, but from thinking about work, not ruminating. Rumination is very, very bad for our well-being, causes cardiovascular disease, impacts our sleep. And we know that when we don't sleep well, we're more stressed. And when we're more stressed, we don't sleep well. So we get in a loop. So we have to switch off. We need to put in place homework boundaries. And, you know, talking about the technology that someone mentioned, if we're on WhatsApp groups all night, gossiping with our colleagues about things that happen during the day, we're not switching off. So it isn't just about not sending work emails. It's about the informal stuff that happens as well that prevents us from switching off. The second one is relaxation. Now, we all think we know what that is, but actually relaxation is about bringing on that parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a whole range of research about what works, but there's research around gardening and owning a pet. Exercising in nature is probably the single most important thing you can do to relax, according to the research. The third thing is having control over how you spend your non-work time. So if you're a busy parent or you're caring for elderly parents and you don't have control over how you spend your free time, you need to find a way of having at least some time during the week, every weekend, and in the holidays. And then the final one, which surprises people, is called mastery experiences. And this is where you're feeling a sense of accomplishment about something that is not connected with your work. So this is something that becomes increasingly more challenging. It could be yoga, it could be learning an instrument, it could be studying about something that's not connected to work, it could be learning a language. But the research shows we have to be engaging in these things regularly and frequently. So, for example, the weekend, the benefit of the weekend only lasts till Tuesday. So there's no point in thinking we can push through from, to next weekend. We need to be having at least 2 or 3 evenings a week where we work, doing this work recovery stuff. What we also know is the benefit of the holiday only lasts about 2 weeks. So in schools, we're always pushing through to the holiday. That's not going to work. What we also know is highly beneficial to experience these work recovery experiences during the working day. And we all hold up our hands and go, in schools, we never have time to do that. I think my record was 12 meetings in a day, starting at 6:45 and finishing at 6 p.m. Didn't have time to go to the bathroom or drink water, but the research shows that micro breaks of only 40 seconds, if we have several of those during the day, can actually be beneficial to us. So I've talked about what schools can do as organisations, but what individuals can do is assess their work recovery and identify which experiences and which times, weekends, evenings, holidays, during the working day, they need to address, and put in place a couple of goals to try to make sure that they're experiencing that work recovery. And I'm hoping for the beginning of next school year, Nancy, we're working on them now, that I will have some tools available to support schools. So if people are interested in those, they should contact me through my email.
You brought up, I was kidding with Ian before with the technology, but he was so right. When looking at the number of emails, that how many times do we keep our phone next to our bedroom? And then we hear ping, 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 and we're thinking.
The first thing I did when I had my burnout was stop all notifications. I have to now go to the browser, and then there are other days where I would agree with my vice principals that today I was going to go home and switch off my phone and put it in the drawer upstairs so that I couldn't go to it, and they would handle everything. And we took it in turns to do that, because that dopamine hit that we get, and it's all addictive, and it's really, really unhealthy. And that's one of the first things we have to stop.
And, I just, when I think about what you said, that psychological detachment, but being allowed to do that, not having that sense of guilt, like I should be working 15 hours a day because I work at an international school. We have to stop that mentality. And then your idea of relaxation, the control of your non-working time, and then mastery experience. There were 2 comments that I just want to address. I know we only have like 2 more minutes, but DJ brought up a very good point of how do you make sure you have the right data? Because you mentioned data, but how do you make sure you have the right data?
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer, because I don't know what data different schools have, but I think what you need is a good wellbeing survey that happens at different times during the year. So if you're asking questions just once a year, then that might not be the right time. I think also, though, you need data about workplace culture, and most wellbeing surveys don't ask those questions about belonging and recognition and appreciation and the quality of respectful interactions and feeling valued and trust and all of those things. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with schools with workplace culture surveys. And then I think that if from your wellbeing survey, you're realizing that workload is an issue, you shouldn't be afraid to dig deeper with a workload survey. And that can be something very straightforward. The ones I use just have different categories of tasks that we do. Am I doing too much of this, too little of this, or about right? And that can give us a lot of information about where the pinch points are in each department or in each school. So I think it's about having a range of data, and it goes beyond that standard wellbeing survey to something a little bit richer.
From your speaking, there's so much nodding. I hope you were able to see what you were just saying, how I think it resonated with so many people here. This conversation, I hope, is just a springboard for many more, because we are thrilled that Helen is going to be facilitating a book share starting next school year. So for anybody, buy your book now. because starting next year, we are having 3 sessions where Helen will be talking about different aspects of her book on September 20th, the 16th of November, and then in January. So those dates will be posted soon on ECIS, but please, if there's something that you're interested in, and if Helen just inspired you in terms of just looking at some of the strategies that she shared today and think of looking for next school year, please join us. Honored and honored and honored that Helen, this is our first loss of many, and really proud that DJ and the International School of Luxembourg, that we're collaborating on this. I'm hoping that after this conversation with Helen, that tomorrow, think about what will you do? What is it that you feel? You might say, you know what, I'm just going to buy the book, or I'm actually going to start looking at those 4 areas that Helen mentioned about psychological detachment. I'm going to start focusing more, but you just spent an hour with us, and we are so fortunate. So I'm hoping that you have that takeaway, and that's the hands. Before we go, we have to do a ritual. This is a new ritual because this is the ISL ECIS law. So everyone get your 2 hands up. Everybody 2 hands up. And on the count of 3, we're waving goodbye. 1, 2, 3. Hands up. Keep on going. And now would everyone please unmute and just say a very, very big thank you to Dr. Helen Kelly for really the time that she spent being with us here today. So could everyone please just unmute, say hello, say goodbye. Thank you, Helen. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much.
Everybody,
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.